One, two, 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 two. One, two. One, two. One, two. One, two.
Right, hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. I am Ned Hammond, Head of Energy and Environment at Onward, and delighted to be your chair for this fascinating discussion on the Great Grid Upgrade. So until recently, delivering network expansion for decarbonising power has really been the sort of like forgotten child of the energy transition compared to renewables generation. But now it's gaining the attention that it really deserves, but not always for the right reasons. But, put simply, we cannot meet our emissions, our energy security, or our economic goals without significant grid expansion. And if we think about where we are today, while the Conservatives are now in opposition at a national level, at a local level, Conservative governments will still be heavily involved in delivering this. And so to discuss all of that and more, I'm delighted to be joined by this brilliant panel. So to my immediate left is Graham Stewart, the MP for Beverley and Holderness, and former Minister for Energy Security and Net Zero, whose brief has included electricity networks. To my far left is Julie Taylor, the Director of Commercial Regulation and Supply Chain at National Grid, who we are delighted are supporting today's event. To my immediate right is Sam Hall, Director of the Conservative Environment Network, whose recent manifesto was called for the acceleration of grid development. Next on my left is Steph Spiro, the Environment Editor at The Express, who has written extensively on grid development in East Anglia. And lastly, to my far left, Josh Buckland, partner at Flint Global, far right, focusing on energy topics, and a former civil servant on a range of energy roles. So the format for today's event will be opening remarks from each of the panelists, and then I will open it up to audience Q&A. So firstly, over to Graham. Perhaps you can talk to us a little bit about your experience as a minister in this role and then what needs to happen next.
Well, thank you, Ned, and good afternoon, everybody. Can I, with your indulgence, Ned, just ask everyone to put their hand up if they're a Conservative Party member? Excellent. Good. I always remember when I was exhausting myself as chairman of the Education Committee, I did a 7:30 breakfast, and it turned out there was only one member in the room, and I thought, I am never doing this again. But anyway, we have a decent mix here of energy professionals and the like. As Ned said, I was responsible until April for energy networks. That's effectively the rollout of new energy infrastructure. Why is that necessary? Because we transformed, under the Conservative government, the energy system of the United Kingdom. We went from less than 7% of our electricity, less than 7 in 2010, was from renewables, till nearly 50% when we handed the reins over to Labour. We transformed the system, and as part of that, and as we seek to harness the vast renewables potential of the UK, we need to rewire the whole of the United Kingdom. That's the fundamental piece, and that's what one has to grasp. That does involve, we have the reason you have pylons, and if you look at the most beautiful view you'll find in England, you will find actually your eye has got used to not seeing certain ugly industrial infrastructure, which is fundamental to making us a rich and prosperous Western nation. We need to build this stuff. There are lots of issues, and we'll hear from the panel, much better informed doubtless than me, on how we do it, how best we do it, how we balance cost with environmental or aesthetic impacts and the like. But fundamentally, we have to rewire this country, and it's something I hope that this Labour government can continue working on. But the system of the facilitator, which is effectively the grid, transmission, local connections, infrastructure, basically lagged that phenomenal transformation we brought to renewables. That's why in July 2022, we appointed Nick Windsor as the UK's first Electricity Networks Commissioner, and went on to get him to look at what we needed to do, and came up with a transmission plan, a connections plan, other components like a strategic spatial energy plan, all of which in order to allow us not to make sure that we don't make the same mess of electricity networks that we did of building one railway coming in this direction from London and supposedly further north. So that's what we did in order to take the timing of transmission infrastructure, which before we started was typically around 14 years from the beginning until it was completed. And then you look at our carbon budgets under the Climate Change Act, which of course we moved from a 80% reduction by 2050 to 100% in June or July 2019, you look at the delivery of that, and you are going to have to make sure that you put this infrastructure in place, and it wouldn't be doable. We wouldn't legally be able to do what we need to do. We wouldn't practically be able to meet our legal obligation, to put it the right way around, if we didn't massively speed up the delivery of energy infrastructure, of which grid and other technology are fundamental. And we'll have doubtless a conversation today about how much can be put offshore, how much can be put underground, and there's quite a lot of offshoring and undergrounding. But the fundamentals at a basic level, there are other experts here, is it costs a lot more. If you put it offshore, you put it underground. It's not rocket science, though there are various different technologies and applications that we can hear about today. But the fundamentals are we want to capture all that green technology that we've got in the UK. We want to harness it so that we can meet our legal obligations under net zero, but we want to do it in a way which gives us, as others follow behind us, gives us a competitive advantage. If we capture, look at a map of Europe, who's got the renewables potential? It's us. If we can capture that, wire that up in a cost-effective manner, then instead of having higher energy costs than our peers in Europe, we can have lower energy costs. That's kind of one of the things in the 2030s that could be not only that we deliver the environmental and legal obligations we have, but we do it in such a way that it gives us a competitive advantage for industry and others, and is a foundation for our prosperity, at which that ends up with a Boris Johnsonian ideal of having your cake and eating it, which was always my driving image and vision, rather, when I was the minister, was can we deliver this stuff in such a way that as others follow, we end up being more competitively advantaged and richer and more prosperous and more secure, while also having led the world in cutting emissions and responding to the science of climate change. That was the vision, and that's what I continue to hope that can be done. But there are lots of excellent questions, doubtless, which we'll hear today to see how practical that is.
Super. Thanks, Graham. Very clear case there for the grid expansion that we need, which I'm sure, Julie, you will agree with a lot of that. But from the company perspective, what do you see as the opportunities to live in this, but also some of the challenges?
Thanks, Ned. So welcome, everyone, and we're delighted to be supporting this event. I'm from National Grid. For those of you who aren't energy industry experts, probably say a little bit about National Grid. We are a networks company. We have about 50-50 interest in the US and the UK. We're based in the UK ourselves. We are the owners of the electricity transmission network in England and Wales, and we supply about 50% of the distribution network in that territory as well. We work with our Scottish colleagues in Scotland to develop and put in place the links which are going to bring the wind down from Scotland as well. We have a number of joint ventures to do that. So I'm going to focus on the UK today, obviously, this being the event, and just a few words about what we're doing and then some asks, really. And I just want to start with where Graham started. I still can't get used to calling Graham. He's called Minister Stewart to me. Just to start where he started, I think we do believe that there is a win-win-win situation here with net zero. The scope to get energy bills down through the use of cheap, plentiful, renewable resources, which the UK has an abundance of, develop our own energy security through not relying on others, and reduce the volatility in the whole system. Our motto, by the way, is clean, fair and affordable, so we care about all of those aspects. It's written into our licence to care about minimising consumer costs as well. We believe those things can be achieved alongside net zero, and we're very positive to be a part of that leadership of that transition. So, practically what we're doing, we have just gone out to raise £30 billion of capital, which will be spent in the next 5 years, to deliver a massive, massive increase in our networks. We're calling it the Great Grid Upgrade. Some of you may have seen our adverts for it. And we passionately believe that if we can do this with the usual level of reliability that network operators in the UK have been able to do these things, which, by the way, is absolutely world class, we're pretty sure we can boost the economy, make sure that skills are present in areas which need upskilling and upgrading in terms of their industrial base, and we can support the delivery of the government's vision for the economy, and we can support everything that the last government set in place to get the absolutely world-class performance on getting carbon out of our system. So we're really, really positive about being part of this. I think one of the things that, as Graham already referred to, is the need to get a better planned position. This isn't going to happen through incremental change at the boundaries. And the work that Nick Windsor did to develop what's called the Central Strategic Network Plan and the Strategic Spatial Energy Plans, we think is a pretty critical part of this. A piece of unfinished business is connections reform, which is a part of that. We need to be able to connect people in a timely way, and at the moment the first come, first served method is not really achieving that. So we have some asks, and very much for the Conservatives in opposition, we would ask you to carry on talking to industry about these sorts of matters, carry on making sure that you pursue the policies you believe are right through the opposition status that you now have. And so one is plans and connections. Planning systems in terms of local planning consents and direct consenting orders. There was a huge amount of progress in the last couple of years. There's still probably more to be done in that space to make sure that large infrastructure projects, not just energy, but all the large infrastructure projects we need, are going through a streamlined planning process. There's a huge amount of delay at the moment. Thirdly, we think communities. Hosting large infrastructure is not always popular. We need to make sure we're putting the investment back into communities so that they can see some benefit to them from hosting this infrastructure. The supply chain, we've had a very, very long conversation with Graham's former department about this over the last couple of years. The supply chain needs to expand by 4 or 5 times its current size to do this. That means skilled people, it means manufacturing facilities. How we're going to do that collectively as an industry and do it in a way that's coordinated and we're not just poaching people from each other and not just grabbing global supply at the expense of other countries. And one of the things we believe is that us achieving net zero and everybody else not being able to do it is a bit like pointless. It's hitting the target and missing the point. So building that supply chain, and finally, and very boringly, but the governance of this needs to be right as well. There are lots of new players in the field. We've already seen National Grid's system operator has become a public sector body. We have Ofgem, obviously, the Department for Energy Security and Net Zero. We have some new players in GB Energy, National Wealth Fund. So making sure that all works together harmoniously. Hopefully, mission control will be part of the solution to that. We also are concerned with. So, in summary, immense challenge, but we are delighted to take it up.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Julie. And you've put up quite a few policy challenges there as well. So perhaps some of the panelists on my other side can help us come up with some of the answers for those over the next 10 or 15 minutes. So Sam, if I come to you first of all, you've been doing some work on the need for this infrastructure, but also on local views and how that interacts with the sort of policy landscape. So perhaps you can take us through your thoughts on that.
Great, thanks very much for that introduction, Ned, and thank you, Onward, for the invitation to speak on this panel today. So, as Ned said, I run the Conservative Environment Network, and we work with Conservative politicians who are passionate about the environment, and I know this issue of how we can build more grid infrastructure is something that comes across their desks and into their inboxes an awful lot. Despite being pro the transition, being pro renewable energy development, they find they have to oppose local infrastructure for transmission networks and grid infrastructure upgrades because such is the strength of the local opposition. So in my remarks I wanted to talk a little bit about some of those political barriers that we face and some of the public opinion research that we've been involved in, and potentially as well touch on a few potential policy solutions. But just to start, I think it is worth restating the case as to why this matters, and I think this is important to start with in terms of bringing people with you. I know some of our other panelists are going to talk about this, but we are forecast to spend up to £3 billion per year on curtailment by the end of this decade. One of the big reasons for that, where essentially we pay wind generators not to generate, is because we haven't built enough of the infrastructure to transmit the power from where it's generated to where it's consumed. So if we want to keep a lid on those curtailment costs and reduce them ideally, we need to build more grid infrastructure. We're also missing out on lots of economic growth and regeneration opportunities. There is a wall of money waiting to invest in energy generation and technologies like offshore wind, but because they can't get grid connections, that investment isn't happening, or it's being delayed. So one figure from Renewable UK last year was that they had 15 billion of offshore wind investment that was being held up by lack of grid connection. We also need it for carbon reasons, for reaching net zero. There is 4 times as much capacity that we will need for meeting net zero currently in the queue, waiting for a grid connection. If we can even connect up a quarter of that, we've got where we need to for our net zero target. So there's no way to hit net zero without more grid connections. And lastly, energy security. Because we're electrifying so much more of our economy in the decades to come, our demand for transport and for heating will be largely met by electricity. It is forecast that we'll see at least a 50% increase in the amount of power needed. And that is before we start adding on top things like artificial intelligence, data centers, which are going to be incredibly power hungry. So we've got to remember when we talk about this that it is essential. It will deliver all of these benefits. But the key barrier that we've got to overcome is bringing local communities with us. And we've been involved in a couple of bits of research, which I'll briefly touch on now, which I think reveals some of the views that we have and some of the features of public opinion. So first, it was a project that we did with the consultancy Public First just over a year ago, and they polled voters in 2 areas of the UK, 19 constituencies in total, split between Oxfordshire and East Anglia. This is in the summer of 2023. And we selected these areas because they are hot areas for opposition to renewable and grid infrastructure development. A few interesting facts came up though. So one stat was that only 9% of voters in those areas had ever taken part in a campaign to oppose a local development. We actually found a lot of latent support there as well for local renewable energy generation. So support for onshore wind or solar developments within 3 miles of people's homes was twice as large as opposition among 2019 Conservative voters. And we found that 2/3 of these people also think the rollout of renewable energy in the UK so far has been too slow. And I think what's really interesting about this is that we hear a lot about the opposition to grid and to renewable energy infrastructure, but there clearly is a lot of passive support. But I think the reason why that's a problem is because it's not a very salient issue for those who are passively supportive. So we need to try and find a way to make the people who do accept the need for new infrastructure, are willing to see it in their backyard, be more vocal about their support. So the only people that politicians hear from are not those in opposition, but also those who want to see the infrastructure go ahead. The second bit of research that we've done, which was more recent, was with the CT group. And this was looking at the Conservative voter coalition at the last election. So we broke down the survey into Conservative 2019 voters who'd switched to Reform, Conservative 2019 voters who'd stuck with the party, Conservative 2019 voters who'd switched to either the Labour Party or the Liberal Democrats, and potential Conservative voters. So these are people that told us that they would consider potentially voting for the Conservatives at the next election. And one of the questions that we put to them was, we showed them a prompt of a news article with a statement from Ed Miliband saying that he would override local opposition to grid infrastructure in order to meet our energy and climate targets. And we asked people whether they agreed with that government policy or not. And there was a big split among the sample size. So Reform switchers, it was net negative 18 approval. Core Conservatives, so the people that stuck with the party, were 0 overall, so balanced opposition and support. Potential Conservative voters were net supportive of overriding local opposition by 9, and Labour, Lib Dem switchers by 28. So I think what this tells us is the Conservative Party is going to have a very difficult job of piecing back together that 2019 coalition. There are very disparate views across the potential supporters of the party going into the next election. So briefly, just to finish, I thought I'd touch on a couple of policy ideas which hopefully can help us overcome some of these political challenges. So one idea that we championed, and Onward did an excellent report on this last year, I think, was this idea of community benefits. So people who are hosting local infrastructure get money off their bills, or potentially money towards some bits of local infrastructure, such as a village hall or some other local public service. The government, in their transmission action plan, I think proposed a figure of £1,000 per decade, which which wasn't necessarily going to be mandatory, but we think it would be sensible to make that mandatory in order that people have the peace of mind that they are going to see some kind of personal return in return for hosting this local infrastructure. I don't think community benefits is the whole answer, though. I think people do want a meaningful say, and they do want to understand the rationale behind why this infrastructure is being developed in the first place. So that's why I'm pretty sceptical of the new government's 2030 clean power target, which I think is going to massively compress the timescales that we have to be able to make this case. Is going to massively compress the timescales we've got to get local people's views, and I think potentially could lead to a bigger backlash against net zero and the energy transition than it is intending to benefit from. I'm sure we'll touch on in the discussion, I'm not going to go into it in detail here, thoughts about how we can reduce the need for some of this transmission infrastructure. So one idea that has been put forward is around locational marginal pricing, where people have heavily discounted bills who are near the infrastructure to encourage them to consume it locally. Another idea would be around encouraging more storage capacity to come online and sources of flexibility. But I'm sure that will feature more in the discussion and very interested in other panelists' views. I'll leave it there. Thanks, Ned.
Great. Thanks very much, Sam. And yeah, a lot there on public perspectives and local views with a lot of quantitative analysis there. So perhaps it's a good point to bring in Steph to talk a little bit about the sort of qualitative side of things. So you spent a lot of time in East Anglia talking to people and getting their local people's views. So maybe you can talk a little bit about their experiences of it and how sort of development can take place there.
Sure. So my inbox very often gets filled with people who are the more, as Sam says, the more vocal opponents to pylons in particular. So in East Anglia, for people who don't know, National Grid's got plans for the Norwich to Tilbury line, and it is the plan is for a 114-mile or 184-kilometre stretch of pylons, which are about up to, I think, 50 metres is the plan. So there are understandably locals who are quite angry about this. They've bought homes in the leafy countryside, and they don't want that view ruined by the pylons. I think so. That's definitely one aspect of it. But I think the other thing is a lack of consultation. I think there's obviously plans to put this energy infrastructure, and that is needed. A lot of it is to accommodate energy from offshore wind farms, and that has to be transported, and so that's needed. But I think a lot of locals tell me that they feel consultations have been a tick box exercise, and they've just been ignored, really. So some of the concerns that come up is the environment, trees, hedgerows, there's that aspect to it. I've spoken to some people who have pacemakers, and they're concerned about electromagnetism. People are worried about the depreciation of their homes. Obviously, to put a pylon in, you need haulage roads, and there's a bunch of destruction and damage that goes along with that. A story that I often go back to is when I was in Ardleigh in Essex, there was one lady I met who had a 300-year-old oak tree, and this oak tree was the reason she purchased her and her husband this property. But there were plans to put a pylon where the oak tree is. And I wrote a story about this, and the very next day, National Grid showed up to inspect the land. They should have done that ages ago. But that I think highlights people's concerns. They try to be vocal, they try to raise these issues, but they just felt like they were being ignored, and that's kind of where the media gets involved. But I think that illustrates how they're just not being listened to, really. So there's that aspect of it. I think there's a lot that could be done. So community benefits, we've already heard about that, but people don't want a playground for their kids or a community hall. They want direct, simple, and fair financial incentives, if that's one possibility. Money off their energy bills, that all helps. But I think considering, and Sam touched on it there, but even like uprating the existing energy grid, so optimizing what exists now to reduce the need for more infrastructure. In East Anglia, a lot of campaigners also have suggested offshoring, having integrated offshore grid, and also undergrounding of cables, which is more expensive. The current plan for the Norwich to Tilbury route, there's 2 bits that are undergrounded. That's because of outstanding areas of natural beauty. So it is possible, it is just more expensive. So there's that aspect. So I'm not sure how realistic that is, but that is what campaigners want. So much so that even the Adrian Ramsey, the co-leader of the Green Party, is anti-pylon because that's how angry his constituents are. As we've heard, a lot of them are very, very pro-green, decarbonisation. They want to protect the planet, but they don't want the pylons. And I think they just want to be heard and listened to in all of this, because ultimately you want people to come along with you in the energy transition. You need people on board because it's more costly to have legal delays. So that local and generating that local support is hugely, hugely important, I think.
Great, thanks, Steph. Yeah, a lot of really interesting anecdotes and perspectives there. I guess I'll give Julie an opportunity to come back on the consultations challenge a bit later on. But first of all, if we go to Josh, we've had a lot of different perspectives there, the policy side, the corporate side, and the sort of local opinion side. I guess you've got a lot of experience in energy policy over the years, so perhaps you can bring your perspectives to what's needed to kind of like unlock the development here.
Thanks, Ned. I won't give the far right perspective as you imply. Give me my kind of balanced view, hopefully. Fundamentally, it's great we're having this panel. When I was in government 5-6 years ago, trying to get anyone interested in the idea of grid infrastructure was difficult. And that's true of the politicians, but also true of the officials and the department, because actually it was always seen that you had the ability to connect whatever generation you put on the system, and that was a kind of given. What's changed fundamentally over the last couple of years is the amount of generation that needs to be built and the location it needs to be built against. So the fact that we're now having a serious conversation about how we build this infrastructure in a coherent way is a positive. And I think the kind of, given a Conservative Party conference, the kind of conservative case for it is the economic one. Graham alluded to this. We do a lot of work with investors. I cannot tell you the number of stories we get now around they want to build infrastructure in this country and they cannot because of grid connections. They can't connect a data center. They can't build. We're dealing with one at the moment that's doing a big economic regeneration project. They're having to delay it because of grid connection. They can get planning approval. They can get the supply chain, all those issues. It's grid is the issue. And that's also true of stuff that we care about on the social infrastructure side. There's plenty of stories about schools and hospitals struggling to get grid connections. And so the kind of economic cost that this has for us as a country is considerable. And other countries are moving on this issue quicker than we are, and therefore the economic story around access to cheap, predictable power will become the economic story over the next 10 years. So the kind of conservative economic story is one that we need to really drive. And I think Graham alluded to kind of the success story the Conservatives have had while in government on generation. It is also worth looking at what was achieved on the grid infrastructure side. There was a lot done around building public awareness. There was a lot done around strategic planning, thinking about the need, regulatory reform, supply chain work. And so there's actually a lot to be applauded on in terms of the progress that was made. And when you now look at what the new government is doing, they're not throwing out wholesale. They may be talking about it in a different way, and kind of Ed Miliband will use a very different language to what we've seen previously. But fundamentally, the reforms they're taking forward are very similar, and they all focus on delivering the assets quicker, using the regulatory system to achieve that. I suppose the difference they're talking about is the use of the planning regime to accelerate the delivery of assets and major planning reform. And I'm sure we can all talk about the kind of the challenges that will experience, but ultimately planning is one of those challenges the previous government didn't quite grapple with. So that's the one area of difference I'd say that at least I'm looking at from the new government and seeing where they get to. Beyond that, I guess the kind of, going last is always the case, the other panelists have mentioned this, but the two areas I'd pull out that I do think they'll need to focus hard on are firstly supply chain, and Julie mentioned this at the outset. We don't have the right number of skilled engineers, skilled kind of construction companies at the scale that's required, and obviously the commodities that are required to build this infrastructure, whether it's cabling, whether it's steel. The supply chain constraints are really significant, and however much you want to go faster on this, the supply chain will be a constraint. So one of the things that the government will have to balance is going faster versus getting UK content into these projects, because there's no quicker way to lose the kind of political and public support that Steph alluded to than a lot of this economic value going abroad. The other thing is kind of the strategic planning of the network infrastructure, which again is something the previous government started. You can't tell communities that they should accept infrastructure that is not planned coherently, is not minimised, and is not done in keeping with the idea and the issues that communities care about. And the way around that is to plan the infrastructure thoughtfully, think about how you reduce constraints, think about how you do it in a coordinated way, because there are processes underway now where areas of the country are getting ripped up, and then areas of the country are getting ripped up next door to it 3 years later. That's not coherent, it's not sensible, and it adds to the political cost that's around it. And the final thing I'd just say, just in terms of the fact that this really matters for us, the constraint cost issue that Sam alluded to earlier is really significant. You're starting to see that really resonate with the public. There's now a bigger debate around whether we should be paying wind farms to turn down, and that is only the start. Constraint costs are very low in comparison to where they're headed by the end of this decade, and unless you build the grid infrastructure, that will become a much bigger issue on all of our energy bills and will fundamentally undermine the political consensus on renewables. So even if we kind of don't buy necessarily the economic arguments, the political arguments and the impact this will have if we don't get a hold of it now will be really significant.
Great. Thanks very much, Josh. Yeah, again, some similar but also some new ideas brought in terms of the challenges that we need to overcome there. I will open up to audience Q&A in a couple of minutes, so get yourselves ready. But I'm going to take the opportunity as chair to ask a couple of quick questions beforehand. So first of all, just on this challenge around the consultation process. So Julie, coming to you. Steph mentioned a couple of sort of specific examples there, and I'm sure there are always individual challenges that come up. Sam also mentioned the fact that decent amount of consultation is needed to get local people's views and make sure they're taken on board, and that presents a challenge for delivering net zero electricity system by 2030. So I guess from your perspective, what changes could be made to that process to make it more effective, but also to happen at the speed that we need it to?
Yes, thank you. And just to be clear, National Grid completely agrees with Steph's assertion that we should be doing very thorough, very detailed consultation for anyone affected by any of our schemes. So that is our intent. It might be worth me saying a word or two about how we go about that, because what can happen is that people are expecting things to happen perhaps earlier than we can actually do them. So what we do in the first instance, we normally have 2 periods of what we call non-statutory consultation. And the first period is just to say, generally, we're going to have to put a line down somewhere. And we've got a very broad swathe, very broad corridor at that point. And that part, we go and consult in order to try and get the whole strategic plan right. And then in the second phase, we start doing the sort of details like exactly where's the pylon going, and we narrow it down to a much smaller corridor. I think one of the things we perhaps haven't communicated as effectively as possible is that at the point that your house might be in that broad corridor, you are probably slightly panicking about what it might mean for you. But actually, when we come to actually then put the pylons actually down in detail, it might be nowhere near your house. And in fact, with recent consultations, we've started using 3D software to show people exactly where the detailed corridor is. I don't know the story of the oak tree, Steph. I'm sorry. I will go back and check with my colleague. It could be that was just a mistake by us, or it could be that your correspondent had not yet got to the point where we decided where they were going, and that's why we came out and did that a bit earlier than we might have done it. I don't know, but that would be my guess. So please, as I say, we completely agree that consultation strategically and in detail is absolutely necessary. And our final point, obviously, is a statutory consultation, which we've just concluded for Norwich to Tilbury.
Great, thanks, Julie. And given Sam mentioned it, it would be remiss of me not to also take the chance to highlight the work that we've done on community benefits. Yes. The report is called Power to the People, if anybody wants to look at it. But Graham, I thought I might ask you a quick question on this, given you would have been involved in government on developing some of the policy around this. And as Sam mentioned on transmission infrastructure, the suggestion was to offer the closest people there, £1,000 per year for 10 years. It seems like arguably a very high figure, or also, maybe not enough to the people who are right next to the pylons. So, how did you kind of think about that kind of policy area, and how what's needed to get people on board in terms of the sort of financial side of things?
Well, it's a sort of psychological process you've got to have, as well as everything else, to work out how you make someone feel that their voice has been heard if they're not happy, and therefore you don't want to make it seem like it's a bribe or whatever against doing something that they think is wrong. But on the other hand, having said and gone through the consultation, made their feelings clear, and feeling that another alternative ideally should be found, and it's not found, at least making that payment. It doesn't want to be so small as to be token, neither does it want to be at a level which cannot be economically justified. Given where I started, we want to do all this in a way that gives us an economic advantage as a nation. So that's very much the thinking, to try and go through that process, and even if people don't get what they want, at least there's a recognition. Look, I'm sorry I do have to do this to you, so to speak, but this is something to show that we acknowledge that you are acting as that steward and custodian of what is vital national infrastructure, and we recognise some cost to yourself. just going through that, and we did an awful lot of work on surveying and the rest of it to try and understand how people view these things and try and get our tone and that of partners right in going through a process that people felt ultimately at the end they might not be happy, but at least they didn't feel insulted and they did feel acknowledged and heard.
Brilliant, thanks, Graham. Okay, so we will open up to audience Q&A now. Can I please just ask that you make sure to ask a question and keep the lead in as brief as possible. I'll take 3 at a time and then go to the panel. So if we can take one at the sort of back right there, and then Ella, do you want to come into the one in the front on your side?
The UK supposedly has some of the highest electricity prices in the world at the moment. How will this vast amount of additional infrastructure and unreliable renewables improve that? Will it make it better or worse?
Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Dave Blackman, representing Utility Week magazine. In a previous meeting which Graham was speaking at, a local Conservative representative argued that his MP in South Northamptonshire had won his or her re-election on the back of opposition to a solar farm in the area. So how does the Conservative Party go about avoiding the temptation to resist this kind of development wherever and whenever it happened, given the political rewards that it's likely to get?
Thank you. And we'll take one more from the woman in the second last row. Ellie, just near. Yeah. There we go. Thank you.
Hi, I represent the CLA, so farms and rural businesses. Unfortunately, sometimes compulsory purchase has to happen, and people are very upset to lose their land. How can we ensure that they get payments quickly for this? We had farmers under HS2 that didn't get payments for up to 5 years after losing their land. You know, we really need to sort this out.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we'll take those in order. So if we start on the sort of, electricity prices are very high in the UK, and does this infrastructure plus also some renewables actually help that? So maybe we'll start with you, Julie, if that's.
Yes, so as I said, I think we believe it will bring bills down. This is a potentially unlimited and infinite resource, and once you've built the infrastructure, the actual running costs of it are very low compared to any other method of generation. You don't have to buy oil or gas to fuel the turbines. So our economics indicates that it will do a huge amount to get electricity prices in the UK to be the lowest in the world, not among the highest. I think we need to be realistic about the transition to that. And in the short term, infrastructure needs to be built, and there will be a cost to this current generation of doing that. It's a political decision as to whether you levy that on consumers, so you let the prices stay high, or whether you levy it on taxpayers by offering subsidies, and different countries around the world have got different approaches to that. But I don't think there's any doubt economically in the long term that this will massively improve the cost of energy in the country.
Okay, great. And Josh, you will have been doing a lot of work on this area, so give your perspectives on this.
Yeah, I agree with Julie. Ultimately, costs and bills are not going to come down in the short term. Let's be very realistic about that. And actually, some of the commitments made or the promises made during the election campaign will be challenging for the new government to deliver against under the time frame they've set out by the end of the Parliament. That's my view, and all the analysis I've seen supports that. The kind of long-term benefit, as Julie describes, is absolutely there, but obviously that will take time to come through and relies upon you not just building the renewables and the grid, but also the other technologies that will be required, the storage, the consumer flexibility, the firm power, the kind of other sources of power that will then ensure you have a balanced system that doesn't cost the earth. And that's, again, what you need to do in the near term versus just focusing on the kind of current crop of technologies. The other thing that Julie says that is absolutely right is a lot of costs are going to shift to becoming essentially fixed costs because they're going to largely be subsidy or network costs. The government has a choice as to how they distribute those costs. And as we've seen through the debate on the winter fuel payment, there is an opportunity to do it in a more constructive way and potentially a more fair and equitable way by shifting costs away from those who are on low incomes. There's also a way not to do it, which is by potentially exposing costs directly across the board, and that's the current approach we have. And so one of the big challenges for the new government will be whether they look again at those distribution of costs as fixed costs start to increase. So that's one of the things that I'm definitely looking out for them to try and grapple with early on.
Super, thanks, Josh. And Graham, so got this challenge around high electricity prices and whether this infrastructure will help, which the answer so far suggests it will, but perhaps you can give your perspective on that as well. But also this issue around, in some cases, the easiest way to get re-elected is just opposition to any of this development. So how do we make sure that the Conservatives don't just move into that pure opposition to all development and actually have a constructive case for this?
Well, I think Aurora, who's the energy consultancy, looked at this, and under all the scenarios they looked at, actually the more of the renewables, it's of course predicated on how much you spend on delivering your infrastructure, whether you get it built or not, so you're not spending even more billions on constraint costs than otherwise, but that fundamentally that delivering this at scale will give us a lower cost system than any alternatives, and it'll also be a much more stable one, so we won't have the sort of spikes because we're no longer having to ship gas in from all around the world and the rest of it. So that's on that. In terms of opposing, I guess if it is unpopular, and often it will be, then the way to do it without coming over as complete hypocrites is to go, well, we recognise the need to build infrastructure, but this isn't being done in the right way, etc. We are, as an opposition party, going to champion our communities, and I hope we'll see how people behave and perform, but I think it's perfectly justifiable to be able to capture that local voice and then guide it and direct it in a way that's hopefully as constructive as possible, but genuinely allows them to be heard. Where a genuine fear would be that somehow through that, and a lot of this stuff will be unpopular, that we kind of convert ourselves into being a kind of anti-net zero, anti-reform party, which is not where you want to be when you get to the general election, however many county by-elections you happen to have won on the back of these issues around the country. So it is about, and that's why this conversation is an important one, to make sure that that the Conservative Environmental Network and Onward and others have a really important role to kind of educate people that how they can legitimately engage on behalf of their communities and yet somehow not end up with ourselves in the wrong place for the future. And on just compulsory purchase, just agree the need for speed. One of these, you need to get things done quickly. And I know Liam Fox championed the cause on behalf of farmers and others who felt that they were not being treated fairly by National Grid, that the cost of getting justice was too high, so they ended up not getting it. And that's why legislation was passed with my support to bring about a faster and cheaper solution.
Great.
Can I just add one thing to that last CPO question? We're a company that fundamentally believe in doing the right thing as well. So, the legislation has changed the position, hopefully, but also I think if we had discovered that we had not paid someone that was owed money for 5 years, we would feel that was a major corporate failure. So, escalating it up through the corporate side would probably also be a good thing to do.
Great, thanks, Julie. And then, so Sam, I guess you'll have potentially opinions on all of these things, but on obviously the election sort of challenge area and how we deal with that. Also, with high electricity prices, you may also want to bring back your conversation about locational pricing again.
Yeah, I'm happy to tackle both of those. Just to pick up first on that point about local opposition, and I do have a huge amount of sympathy with politicians on this, because you get people like me that come in and say, well, polls show it's actually really popular, and I think what that misses is that it is popular generally, but it tends to have a low salience for those voters among whom it is popular, whereas for those who are opposed, I think the issue has a very high salience. So it may well affect the votes of the people who are vehemently opposed, whereas those who are in favour, is this something that will really shift their vote or not? I think the way to try and overcome that is to try and make it a higher salience issue for those who are generally in support of more renewable energy generation, more grid infrastructure, and that's why, again, to return to the point about community benefits, that sense that people have got some kind of stake in this, they're going to see direct benefits that they would lose out if the development didn't go ahead. And kind of linked to that, and also probably tying in that question as well, I think, the argument that I think the Conservatives need to win in order to get back into power, and certainly drawing here on the Foundation's essay that some of you might have seen by Sam Bowman, Samuel Hughes, and Ben Southwood, which I don't agree with all of, but I think the kind of core argument around the fact that we just need to build stuff, we need to make investment easier, that we could be much richer as a country if we didn't block through the state lots of productive infrastructure that can make our country more joined up, that can make it easier for people to live where they want to do. That, I think, is the kind of position that the Conservative Party needs to be in terms of our economic policy. And I worry that if we are opposing at a local level all this infrastructure, we will not be able to make that case about how we can grow as a country, how we can get wealthier, how we can get richer. And I think, Conservatives, we're not the Liberal Democrats. We're not people that will say things at a national level and be very locally specific in opposing things. We are aspiring to be a party of government, and I think we should wrestle in an open way with the trade-offs that are involved in this area, and we shouldn't just oppose everything at a local level. That would be my.
Super. Yeah, thanks, Sam. And Steph, just coming in on these points around sort of like compulsory purchase payments and the challenges that can create for sort of local views.
Well, actually, I think the best way to get people on side and lower that opposition is to educate people and teach them why decarbonisation matters, why they need to play their part, and I think that'll go a huge way in getting people to accept the infrastructure. The media has a huge role to play in that by educating people on renewables and why that's needed, as does the government. Julie mentioned the adverts and various comms that goes into that. That's obviously vital. I think I often hear things are quite patchy on the ground. So when it comes to speedy payments, I think sometimes there's a feeling that there's not a joined up approach. People don't really know who's in charge of what. I think there's sometimes a lack of resources, a lack of staff, which doesn't help. Josh mentioned earlier, a spatial energy plan would really help with that. So everyone would know where they stand, who's in charge of what's going where, and that would help make everyone's roles a lot clearer. And I think sometimes within government departments as well, local authorities, if there's just a very clear delineation of who's in charge of what, that would help speed things up, not only with payments and reimbursements, but with a whole bunch of things across the supply chain.
Great, thanks, Steph. Okay, let's open up for another round of questions. So if we can go the sort of woman on the sort of third row just on the inside there, Niles, to start with.
Shall I kick off?
Yes, sorry.
Thanks. Anne-Marie Wilkinson, Star Energy. The strapline is decarbonising power. There is a significant challenge in decarbonising heat in the UK. I'm just wondering, and Graham will know this because we've spoken about geothermal, why we're not looking at these technologies that can actually take power off the grid and can be delivered locally.
Thank you. And let's take one from the back of the standing area. So the woman at the back, standing in the corner.
Hi, Yazela Farmer, Chief Executive of BEMA. We represent manufacturers of electrical products, so our members are really at the heart of delivering on this grid upgrade. I really agree with the comment that we need to educate consumers, and the media have an important role to play. I know we have a campaign ongoing for grid upgrade. We've had in the past other national campaigns on smart metering and other energy efficiency programs. But how do we educate consumers on the wider energy security and net zero transition? It's vital. I think it's at the heart of the whole issue we're discussing here, but it is not an easy thing to do. Who leads that? How do we empower the media? Yeah.
Thank you. And let's take one from the front as well. So, Naz, if you can come to the front corner here. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a point Steph's touched on, is local consultation, because I know it's not just an energy area problem, because there is a lot of different areas in which the public do feel like consultation is just ignoring them, which leads to the protests and then it never actually happening because people get elected promising it. Based on what you've heard, because you've clearly heard a lot in East Anglia about consultation problems, what do you think that could be done to improve on consultation so this doesn't keep happening and we can actually get things done?
Great, thank you. All right, well, again, we'll sort of go broadly in order. So if we start on the sort of decarbonising heat side of things and some of the sort of non-grid technologies that might be available. Graham, what was your experience in government looking at some of those things, and how big a role do you think they have to play?
Well, it was put in the context particularly of geothermal and as one of the technologies that could help with the decarbonisation of heat. There's quite a lot of old coal mines actually have been harnessed. I've been to visit those and see how that's then linked to heat networks as one way of doing it. When I was responsible for net zero and the legal obligations under the Climate Change Act, and I looked at what I had flashing red lights on, and decarbonisation of heat would be right up there as one of them in which we are furthest behind. And so we need to harness and create regulatory systems which encourage the coming forward of any number of solutions to help decarbonise heat. So whether that's looking at low carbon in the meantime, ideally zero carbon fuels to replace existing fuels in some off-grid homes in certain parts of the country, heat networks often in more urban areas, looking at geothermal. There's a whole series of challenges involved in the decarbonisation of heat, as well as seeing more and more heat pumps going out there. And again, that goes back, in terms of the decarbonisation of heat, one of the things we've done is we have loaded, because it was, I think, administratively easier, we have loaded the kind of various system costs onto electricity and not gas. So we have this ironic position where we want to get people off burning fossil fuel and onto using electricity, and then we put all the costs of it, whether it's companies, distributors going bankrupt or green levies or we shoved them all on electricity. So we're kind of getting ourselves off that hook was one of the things we were looking at, because those costs, if they can be put onto gas rather than onto electricity then becomes relatively more competitive, which makes the heat pump, the economics of buying a heat pump are transformed. There's so many areas, there's an awful lot in the sort of dense regulatory sphere which needs to be unpicked and that we were working on. And it always ends up being slower than you would like, especially given the urgency with which we need to act.
Great, thanks, Graham. And Josh, on this one as well, I guess Graham sort of alluded to that electrification could actually play a big role in decarbonising heat too, but some other technologies that might be required as well. What's sort of your perspective on this side of things?
Yeah, I think it kind of comes on to a broader point. Like, the government is not very good at taking account of two things because of the nature of the way the kind of climate targets work. The kind of value of small interventions. It's largely driven by what is the biggest bang for buck you get at a large scale, hence the focus obviously on power, whereas actually a lot of the changes that are needed on heat and local energy will be small scale changes built up over time. So how you value kind of local interventions that then scale over time is not done very well, at least in my view. The other thing that's really not done well is the value of technology innovation and how you account for that in terms of development of new technologies, how those will potentially change the dynamics around the need to cut carbon as well as cut bills over time. And so how any government thinks quite carefully about those two issues, for me, will then define the success of other interventions beyond just the kind of big scale generation and network infrastructure. Just on the kind of public campaign side, I'm not by any means a kind of public comms expert, but I think the thing I would just be cautious on is the language around educating customers. Like, educating is something that has kind of connotations as kind of the big state, the government telling you what to do. But I think, at least from when I was in government, the way we used to think about it was, how do we tell a story that there is both something that benefits you as an individual, back to the kind of community benefits kind of dynamic, but also how do you then connect that into a sense that it's a national mission? Because a national mission that just impacts you and makes you worse off is never going to resonate. But if you can have two of those things and you connect that kind of citizen responsibility theme whilst also having something that benefits you, you can have something that resonates with a wider group in society. So for me, that's how you need to come up with a set of messages and tactics for engagement that reflect that theme, rather than necessarily saying to people, this is what you should think or do, because that's where you then get into challenges around a pushback, as we've seen in other areas of the net zero agenda, particularly actually on heat, where any talk about we're going to go into your home and ban your boiler has led to a big backlash, unnecessarily in some ways, because that was never actually the policy. So it comes back a little bit of that national mission and personal benefit, which we need to get right.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. That's really good thoughts on the consumer side of things as well. So, yeah, I guess, Steph, we can come to you on that side too. So, education might be the wrong word, maybe awareness and positivity towards it, but also on the local consultation question as well. So, consumer awareness, and then also how we can improve that consultation.
So I think the war in Ukraine is a fantastic opportunity. People have felt the impact of being dependent on fossil fuels from abroad. So there's a fantastic opportunity for the need to prioritize and inform people about the importance of homegrown renewable energy. You said who leads that? I think it's up to everyone. The thing about news is it's cyclical, and my inbox is heaving with 1,001 people who want me to look at 1,001 things. So, and the nature of news is things kind of move on very quickly, but I'm sure every single person in this room can play their part, whether it's onward or send through reports or people raising awareness about a really cool product, because ultimately news should be new. So any innovations, that helps. As Josh suggested, people kind of want to know what's in it for them, how are they going to benefit, and that's the best way for media to get through to people, I think, and we all have a role to play in that, especially the media. I think also consistency when it comes to government policy helps. So if government sets a direction, sticks with that direction, there's less confusion among consumers then, for sure. So everyone should play their part and inform consumers. And then in terms of local consultations, some of the concerns that I've heard range from them being held at random times during the day when most people are at work. So that's one issue. Or consultations open, but locals don't get told when or how to engage with them. Or they don't get replies to their concerns. I think other countries sometimes have just like a single portal. They can go in and it's all on one page or one post box address for people who are older. Julie might have some ideas of how they've been able to improve their consultation process. But I think ultimately, I think there just needs to be very active engagement. People just want to know that they're being heard. And I think sometimes when there's many different cooks involved, it's just a lot's coming from many different directions, and it's just not very joined up. And I think that's when the issue is. So someone might talk to a local about one aspect, pitch up talk about another aspect, and there's just all these consultations, but it's not actually being fed into a central system. But Julie might be better placed to talk about how they've improved things in recent years.
Thanks, Steph. Yeah, and so Julia, we've got the sort of consultation side of things, which we've obviously talked a little bit about already, but you may have maybe some more thoughts on what specifically could improve them. And then on this consumer awareness side of things, obviously you were saying you're running the campaign. What else could government and media and other stakeholders be doing to kind of like help you make that case?
Yeah, thank you. I do want to talk about that second item very much, actually, and the first. I think the issue with local consultation is probably, I think Steph's probably put a finger on it. The biggest problem is that you've got this whole ecosystem of players and we're all taking bits to the public. And I do wonder if there's some, as a former policy official in government, I do wonder if there's some sort of better way to do that. I mean, even in the energy industry, the wind farm will consult on erecting the wind farm and then we'll consult on putting the link in and it. I can see we're trying to join up where we can. We're self-organising to join up, but it could be much more structured. I think that's a critical thing. And on the question of how taxpayers, consumers, residents feel about all of this and what they know about it, I do think there is a massive role for trusted reporters and politicians to take an interest in making sure that people do actually have facts and probably make sure that they are fundamentally aware of why we're doing this. An interesting thing about our campaign is that for many years we considered it a success if nobody knew what we were doing. This is the first time we've done a national campaign ever. We considered it a success that nobody had heard of National Grid.
Yeah.
And it was only in this last year where we thought, now we're building stuff and people need to know why we're building stuff. We sort of need to explain ourselves a bit more. I think with hindsight, we might have started that process a bit earlier.
Okay, great. Thanks, Julie. Okay, we might be able to sneak in one more question. So I'm just going to make it, where am I going to choose it from? Can we go for the back row, please? Just make it easy for my colleagues with the mics.
Thanks so much. Richard Rout, it was me who lost to Adrian Ramsey in Waveney Valley on the back of the many issues, but the pylons amongst them. I heard Sam allude to it earlier. And do the panel think there is a risk in the haste that's being injected into the process to decarbonise the grid by 2030 that we will, in fact, turn more people against net zero and not have the space for the necessary reforms that everybody wants to see?
Okay, nice tricky one to finish with. Sam, given you mentioned it earlier on, perhaps you can just delve into that into a little bit more detail, and then maybe I'll give Graham and Julie an opportunity to say on that as well.
Yeah, very happy to. I think there are some substantial risks to aiming for the 2030 clean power target. So we've touched on one already, which is this is going to compress the timescales to consult local communities about renewable energy infrastructure. But I think there are a few others as well. I think we want to have competitive auctions every year for renewable energy, and a danger that I could see coming in the next few years is Ed Miliband is going to need to have every project that could possibly go winning a contract in that CFD auction in order to hit his 2030 target. So you reduce some of the competitive pressure that I think has been a welcome downward force on our electricity prices. I think another risk is around the sort of technology mix as well. We know that SMRs are not going to come online in the UK until at least the mid-2030s. Is there a danger that Ed Miliband goes slow on the nuclear rollout, which I think is an important complement to renewable energy and the wider energy mix? So, I kind of worry that he's going to drive us down a particular route based on the technologies that are available right now in terms of being ready to deploy, and we're not going to have this wider mix. And a final one, which I know Graham might disagree with me on this, but I also worry that he's going to give Drax a new subsidy contract as well on biomass, because, again, it's going to be very hard to hit that 2030 target without keeping biomass. And I think there are some serious sustainability issues that Drax needs to deal with as well. So I think there are a whole range of risks around the 2030 target, and I think even though the Conservative government's target was 95% clean power by 2030, it doesn't seem like a big difference. That last 5% with all the balancing and what you do about unabated gas is really difficult. I'm wary as someone who's strongly supportive of net zero that it does risk being counterproductive.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks for bringing up a whole different can of worms at the end of the panel session. So, Graham, just quickly, your thoughts on this. I know you're obviously very pro the development that we need to do, but is there a sort of challenge around trying to do it by 2030?
Well, I'm not sure that we can deliver by 2030. For starting, I say this 90. Journalists will say to me, "Oh, it's 95% versus 100. What's the difference?" Well, because sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, in which case you have to have the balancing. What balancing do we have? If you want to make that zero in 2030, and then, I just don't think it can be done. But the question is more about, does going to an artificial timetable deliverable or not? And I would believe undeliverable, just technically, almost regardless of cost. Can it have negative impacts? And it can have lots. I agree with Sam on the costs issue. What's the point of getting to net zero electricity? Remember, it is just electricity we're talking about in 2030. If we have a system which in 2032 we regret, that'd be madness. We're part of trying to get to 2050 in a rational way that balances the economic with the environmental, so it carries people with you. One of this thing about him being so gung-ho and so ideological is that the very tone of Ed Miliband starts to make the numbers who want to oppose net zero grow. Whereas you've got to talk about the fact that we're going to do this pragmatically, sensibly. We're going to find a way that's economically rational, that leaves us stronger, not weaker, not just as a global leader in this environment piece, but actually as a stronger nation, more secure. And so that's the issue. And the SMR's point is quite right. Sam didn't mention locational pricing. The REMA, it's very technical stuff, but this review of electricity market arrangements looking at zonal pricing, locational pricing, basically. Again, there's a danger that rather than moving towards that direction, which could again create a more rational response, mean that energy that otherwise would be just wasted is directed towards other uses, etc., that he gets rid of that, because if you need to deliver by 2030, you haven't got time for the market to adjust to a new impulse such as locational pricing. It could delay, cause some pause for investors. Well, if fundamentally you need to rejig the system, you're going to have to accept there will be a little bit of a pause, manage it down. But again, we could lose that. And finally, on Drax, I kind of agree with Sam in some way. I think Drax is a good thing, but Drax can only be part of a zero carbon 2030 if you could put the carbon capture and storage system in place for it, and you can't by 2030. That's literally impossible. But I do think Drax does, personally, I think it has got a really good future, and I know it seems intuitively crazy to be taking these wood chips from one side of the world, shipping it to the other, and then burning it, and then with higher emissions going out than you'd get from coal or whatever, and it seems mad. In fact, it isn't mad. The stuff genuinely is, it's the CO2 comes when the trees grow. They are cropped in the normal way if they are maintained as a carbon stock, and then they are burnt. If you then sensibly and at a realistic time frame in the 2030s put carbon capture on it, you will have genuinely negative emissions, which is critical to the delivery of what I hope would be perhaps the world's first net zero industrial cluster around the Humber, for instance, which would have massive inward investment potential. Companies that signed up to this would come in. But you want to do it rationally and sensibly, and the trouble is that Ed Miliband appears to let this political soundbite. I would give him as much cover as I could to drop it. I mean, I guess we'd have to throw a few rocks at him, but in truth, it's just stupid. And if he wants to do net zero in a way, if he wants to make the Labour government re-electable and deliver net zero, he should drop it right now. And we should throw a few raspberries at him, but let him off the hook of this absurd promise, which has, and I'm sure that's just the beginning. I'd love people to do more work. How many more negatives are there of coming up with something which is literally undeliverable and insisting you're going to do it? Civil servants will come up with rules and regulations that fit with something which actually they know it can't be done. There'll be all sorts of negative costs which we can't easily identify in this room. These are just the ones that come to us from the top of our heads.
All right. Thanks, Graham. And Julie, I don't really want to get into the sort of like politics of all this, but how about? But you might want to talk a little bit about how Grid is like, trying to develop at the pace that we kind of need in order to hit some of these goals, not necessarily hit that specific target, but decarbonise and reach our energy security ambitions.
Sure. So the first thing to say is we don't technically have a view yet on what can be done by 2030. We're working with the electricity system operator. We're working in good spirits. We might also share some scepticism about the question of whether this could be done at all. But that will come out in November, December when that work is available. One thing I'd just like to leave people with, when the original transmission grid was built in the 50s, 60s, it was built with a great deal of thought and planning, and it lasted us 60 or so years before it really needed major surgery. This process we're embarking on now is not a 5-year or 10-year process, it's a 30 to 50-year process. And this question of getting the basis of it right and doing it right from the beginning is pretty critical. And we as the experts and industrialists in all of this would defend that to the hilt. That this is, future generations will pay the price for any mistakes we make. And so we will be defending the grid from any sorts of decisions that would threaten that fundamental basis.
Brilliant. Thanks, Julie. I think that's a great note to end on. So that just leaves me to thank you in the audience for joining us for a great discussion. Thanks to National Grid for supporting today's event. And thank you to our fantastic panel. So if you could please just join me in giving a round of applause to Graham, Julie, Sam, Steph, and Josh.